creative dialogue. He did it very well last year, so I'm sure that will be okay this year too. And tonight, your voice will be heard beyond Nigeria through live broadcasts on Facebook and YouTube. I would like to thank especially our media partner, Tech Cabal, the online publication for African tech, which made these live feeds possible. So please be all welcome for this celebration, and let's all listen to the ones who contribute to bring more ideas to their field. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let us enjoy this evening together. Je vous remercie et bonne soirée.
Thank you very much, and good evening to you all, and welcome in this superb auditorium, which is beautiful, isn't it? My name is Tancrède, which is a long, impossible French name. Don't be afraid to mispronounce it. Even for French people, it's a pain. The good news for you with my family name is that voiturier in English means parking valet, which in a way commands me to be humble and brief. I'm very pleased and honored to be moderator of this second night of Ideas here in Lagos. And when I'm not a moderator, I'm an economist and researcher, and I've been based in Abuja for the last 2 years. But enough with me. Let's talk about ideas and the night of ideas. There is a common saying according to which ideas matter, and more than that, ideas can change the world. I'm sure you have heard this sentence once in your life. Do you believe that ideas can change the world? If so, raise your hand. If you don't believe that ideas can change the world, raise your hand. If you believe they can change and they cannot change, I'm sure you're an economist, because they always respond by, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to any question they're asked. Yeah, the good news is that most of you, 98% roughly, believe that ideas can change the world. So it's a good start. We'll be exploring various facets and perspectives of being alive. We have brilliant speakers coming from different horizons, with different background, different professions, different citizenships. Yet they all have in common, I think, converging ideas about what being alive means to them. And additionally, and more importantly, maybe, what this particular meaning urges them to do and not to do, so as to live up to the challenges of living a meaningful life in a crazy world. This night will be like a journey. I see it like a journey across different states. We'll have the solid part, the liquid part, and the gas. Let me explain. You will have and listen to evidence, facts, data, knowledge conveyed by our speakers. But they won't restrict to this. They will also explore the more liquid and difficult thing to grasp, in particular including sentiments or personal history, which very often are enmeshed with their professional life and choices. And beyond this, they will also touch upon the most immaterial part of being alive, providing us with a few insights on what is their own feeling and sense of their responsibility in changing the course of affairs. What is their own and personal narrative on their impact? I hope we will listen to them on this point. To guide us in this journey, we have these wonderful speakers Maboula, Amara, Iheanyi. And we also have his brilliant audience. So we much rely on you after the presentations to react, to exchange, to bring in your ideas, your comments, to be provocative. And as we would say in French, to shake the coconut tree, which doesn't exist in English. In English, it is, I think, to cast the cat with the pigeons. So I can be the pigeon. I'm already the parking valet, I can be the pigeon. So you can cast the cat on me. And thanks to your reaction, we'll have a lively debate. I will conclude with my two main wishes or objectives. The first one is that each of you leaving this room will leave this room with one additional knowledge, information, idea he or she didn't have when coming in. You let me know. My second wish, on the top of that, is that you will have sharpened your own ideas and understanding of how make the best use of your sense of living to make it a game changer for the life of the people who matter for you. How we will proceed? We will have 3 speakers speaking in a row, 10 minutes each. They've been generously offered 10 minutes each. They've accepted. They've been asked to be brilliant, provocative, smart, witty, entertaining, flabbergasting. They accepted. So thank you very much. We're grateful. Then we have exchanges across them, a few comments and questions, and then we'll open to the room. Is it okay for you? If it is, let's start. And if you're okay, Maboula, we'll start with you. So you have mics all over the place. I turned this one works well.
Okay.
And the clicker, you don't need anything.
Okay, so I'm just standing and trying to be like you, Tancrède, as lively and moving as you. So we have 10 minutes. Good evening, everyone. As it was said before, my name is Maboula SOUMAHORO. I have 10 minutes to be brilliant, provocative, and to offer rich and complex reflections on what it means to be alive. This is a great task. But before starting this journey of reflections, I would like to begin by thank yous. Even if I lose 1 minute, I believe thank yous are important. So thank you to the Alliance Française for having me. Thank you, Charles Courdon and all the team, Maurice Chapeau. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Christelle Folly and all the team for making this first trip to Lagos, Nigeria, at last, given that I am a scholar of the African diaspora. I have to say that I had heard a lot about Lagos and Nigeria, that Nigerians tend to brag about their country. So it's a good thing for me that I came to see and discover a portion of your country for the first time in my life. I think that beyond the thank yous, I think the positioning is of importance. So as I said, I'm speaking here today from Lagos, Nigeria, coming from Paris, France, by way of the Ivory Coast, where my parents are from, and my parents migrated to France in the 1960s. So when I think about Nigeria, when I think about this African continent, of course, I have a personal and intimate relationship with the continent, but I also have an expertise and scholarship about this area, what is called the Atlantic world. So when I think about Nigeria, I think about 1789, and I think about Oloda Equiano, who wrote and published one of the first narratives dedicated to the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, and with the narrative of his life, he was one of the early abolitionists who circulated this Atlantic zone to fight and to demand the end of slavery and the end of the slave trade. This is an affirmation of life. This is what being alive for an African African for what was to become a Nigerian centuries later meant in the late 18th century. When I come to Nigeria, I also have in mind, because of my intellectual background, the person who is often referred to as the founder of African literature, no less, Chinua Achebe, and with works such as Things Fall Apart, for instance, with the beauty and the richness and the complexity of the ideas and the literature that was offered in this post-colonial era, this was also an affirmation of life. This was being alive, being fully human as an African in the second part of the 20th century. I'm thinking also about one of your great Nigerian and international artists by the name of Fela Kuti, who went beyond Nigeria, who went to the United States, but who was also listened to all throughout the world, including the Ivory Coast of my parents, including the Paris I grew up with. So I am humbled to be in the home, in the land that produced Fela Kuti. When I speak about Fela Kuti, I also have in mind his mother and his grandmother and all the strong women of his ancestry who fought for African Nigerian women's rights in your land. So this is a great honor for me to be here. And I try to use those examples as an introduction to insist on one approach of what being alive could mean. What being alive could mean when, let's say, life could be or has been determined throughout the world, throughout history, on the basis of skin color, on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of religion, on the basis of, I'll say it again, race, but also gender, sexuality, location, right? If we try to make connections with, I don't know, ecological matters, environmental issues, climatic change, what does it mean to be alive in a part of the world, let's say the Caribbean, for instance, that is scheduled to disappear from this earth? What does it mean to be alive for humans who I believe should emphasize, should perhaps claim and demand or have a sense of entitlement, sorry. The French will pop up sometimes. Entitlement, and be denied this right to life. What does it mean to die on the way to Europe, on the way to the north, when crossing the Sahara desert, desert, when do human beings that are referred to as Africans, that are simply sometimes and easily described along nationality lines, do they have the right to this life? Do they have a right to stay alive? Can you be alive when you're poor? Can you be alive when you're a woman? Can you be alive when you're a child? Can you be alive? Does your right to be alive have to be negotiated, made, let's say, less important on the basis of all the lines that I have just described: race, class, gender, sexuality, your level, your degree of ableism, for instance. So these are the issues that comes to mind when I think of this question, this very vast question of being alive. Maybe that being alive today means to be asking questions, to call things into question, to not accept the world as it exists. We're living in a world, and everybody knows, I hope we can agree, that the world is unequal, that the world is unfair, that the world produces a lot of, I don't know, gaps of any kind. And I think that what could save humanity, what the idea, we'll see what we can do with those ideas, but the idea, the dream, the hope needs to be a constant affirmation of existence. And I think that this sense of entitlement that I've mentioned earlier is this human entitlement to life. life for everyone, not depending on any of the statuses. So I think, would somebody tell me to stop? Okay, so I can continue. So I think that if we could approach this idea, this question of what being alive can mean in the world, we could look at it as, at first, at a very basic level. Being alive means, biologically, to not be dead, right? So while we are not dead, while we are still on this earth, what are we going to do about our time here? And what are the things that should limit our freedom of mobility, and our freedom of having a fulfilled existence? So I think that this affirmation of existence, of life, whether it was in the struggle, whether it was in politics, whether it was in the arts, whether it was in social justice, are proofs that we need as human beings to remind ourselves, and perhaps to remind the rest of the world, that life is what is most precious for all of us. Being alive means, for a human being, to be entitled to justice, to be entitled to equality, and to be entitled to dignity. This is my take on this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was perfect, not on the substance, it was obvious, but on the time, which is a detail. So thank you very much. I noticed, but keep your questions and comment in the back of your head, because there will be further presentations. You mentioned the fact that, just two things to pinpoint, that what is it to be alive when you know what will come next, and what comes next can be a shorter life expectancy than your neighbor, or simply the fact that your island will disappear because of someone has been polluting somewhere. So how do you behave on the basis of that? And the second thing is the word of entitlement and rights, and I'm sure we'll be back to that, on how can we enforce and secure these rights, which is a broad issue, but it can be very concrete on some particular things. So thanks for this, and let's continue with a 10 minutes presentation by Amara. You have, I think, some slides to show, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Hi. Good evening, everyone. Femi, are you there? Can't see my slides. While we're sorting out the slides, just want to ask a quick question. How many of us here are 30 years and above? 30 years and above. Okay, I think you might just close your ears right now, because no, I was just kidding. Of course, there's a lot that I will talk about here that would also matter to you, even if we know that you are not going to be here. Okay, no, maybe you will be. But I'm just saying, I mean, if you're Nigerian, the life expectancy is 53 years old and a little bit. So if you are above the age of 53 in Nigeria, you're living on borrowed time, or you're doing better than expected. Being alive in Lagos in 2050. Well, I was invited here to do a bit of divination, so telling the future. But actually what I'm going to do is to use what I've learned from researching climate impacts in Nigeria over the last 7 years to try and answer the question that you see on the slide. How will climate and environmental changes impact the quality of life in Lagos over the next 30 years? To do that, I'd like us to examine what are the factors that make Lagos particularly vulnerable to climate and environmental change. It's one that we're very familiar with: population. Lagos has a huge population, but also the population growth rate is rapid. it's growing at a rate of 3.2% every year. This means that by 2050, we're looking at 32.6 million people cramped into this small space called Lagos. And that, you know what that means, of course. It means that there will be more pressure on the environment, there will be greater potential for pollution, and of course, there will be greater pressure on public infrastructure. But interestingly, 2 out of 3 Lagosians live in slums at the moment. This means there are people who are living in areas where there's limited coverage of public services, in areas where there's little public infrastructure, and little or no social safety nets. So they're exposed to shocks, environmental, events or catastrophes. The terrain is also low. Of course, some of you who have waded through storms or even swam through them in Lagos would know just how low and flat the terrain is here. 12% of the area is susceptible to seasonal flooding. There's a high water table, and I think I would come back to this later in the presentation, but it's something that we need to put at the back of our minds. And then Lagos is exposed to 180 kilometers of coastline. And of course, that's a risk. Over the last 30 years, there's been rapid urban development in Lagos too as well. And a lot of this urban development has been uncontrolled. And so what we have is there's been a rapid loss of the natural vegetative cover. So many areas in Lagos have lost all of the wetland cover. And the wetland cover usually protects the wetland from flood and surges. And we'll see why that's important. But apart from that, because we've got a lot of impermeable surfaces right now in Lagos, it's increased the violence of the urban runoff. And so, of course, you have a lot more erosion and a lot more flooding too as well. Lagos is also the hub of industrial activity in Nigeria. I think it's about 65% of all the manufacturing happens here. And industrial activity, we know, is a culprit for pollution. And so we've got to keep an eye on that too as well, especially the new refinery that is coming up in Lagos, which is touted to be one of the biggest in Africa. Well, refineries are known to have a lot of effluence, and so we might want to pay attention to how that's affecting the future in Lagos. Now, what are the potential climate stresses that Lagos will be exposed to in the next 30 years? The first is a temperature rise. Now, we know from NIMET that in the period between 1941 and the year 2000, the average temperature in Lagos rose by 2 degrees. Now, but that rate is accelerating. And so now, according to the National Adaptation Strategy and Plan of Action for Climate Change in Nigeria, we're expecting up to a 1.2 degrees Celsius rise in average temperatures in Lagos over the next 30 years. With rainfall, it's going to get worse. Now, of course, because Lagos is coastal, the higher temperatures will result in more evaporation from the sea, and that would increase both the volume of rainfall as well as the length of the rainfall season in Lagos. Now, when it comes to extreme weather events, this is also not good news, because Lagos would experience the 2 ends of the spectrum. An increase in the number of extreme heat days. These are days that the temperature will exceed 38 degrees Celsius. There's also going to be an increase in excessive rainfall days. And these are days when the rainfall would exceed 50 millimeters. And finally, the sea level, just like everywhere else in the world, it's a global phenomenon. Sea level is rising. According to the IPCC, this is happening at a rate of 3.1 millimeters every year. And for Lagos, that would add up to about 10 centimeters in the next 30 years. This might look small to you, but if you combine that with the aggressive storm surges that you have along the Atlantic, you would see, of course, that the impact is very huge. And that's where we'll start with the impact. Now, this stressors on a vulnerable environment like Lagos, what would we expect to happen in terms of impact? Now, the first thing is shoreline erosion. So, how many of you love the beaches in Lagos? How many of you have gone out to the beach in Lagos to have a good time? Well, in the next 30 years, we don't know what would happen to all of those beaches. I mean, I think it was 25 years ago I came here to Lagos. I had a good time at Bar Beach. It's no more. It's gone. Now, the shoreline erosion rates in Lagos are aggressive. It's measured at 14 to 30 meters every year. Now, another thing that we would expect would happen is that infrastructure will decay or deteriorate faster. So bitumen roads will go faster. Housing, materials that you used to build will deteriorate at a faster rate. Now, this might mean that, the cost of maintenance, if they don't maintain the roads very well, then the cost of maintenance of your car would definitely go higher. But if they do maintain the roads better, which we hope, then you feel the cost in your pocket as taxes. But whichever way you don't escape, you will still feel some impact from deterioration of public infrastructure. The other thing, of course, would be an increase in energy demand. It'll get hotter. So guess what? You'd have to run the air conditioner longer. At lower temperatures, you'd have to, you have to drink a lot more cold water. And where's that energy going to come from? Hopefully, and God forbid that it comes from generators in the next 30 years. But if it does, then not only will we be increasing our dependence on fossil fuels, but we'll also be driving a whole lot more pollution. And then if, for instance, the government is still paying petrol subsidies at the time when we are doing all of this, then you can imagine just where all your public funds will be going. Well, if you have more floods, you've got more stormy days, there's going to be a whole lot more inundation. So houses probably get damaged. There will be an acceleration in erosion. So all of that erosion you're seeing around Lekki, imagine a lot more of that. God forbid, buildings will collapse. And this is if we don't do anything. Lives could be lost, and our transportation systems would be disrupted. Now, let's go back a little bit. Now, this is something that we need to keep an eye on, the quality of ground and surface water. Now, with all the urban runoff that is happening, with impermeable surfaces, all the industrial activities that's happening, some of the farming that's happening with fertilizers, diesel generators that are running, a lot of chemicals are being gathered by water from all across the city, and it's going into the groundwater. And remember we said that the water table is very low. So there is a high chance that there would be contamination in the groundwater in Lagos. There's also seepage from sewage as well because of all of these problems. And I think Queen's College recently had a problem with sewage seepage that caused an epidemic there. Keep in mind that 80% of Lagosians depend on privately sunk boreholes for their water. And so in that case, what would happen is that if you're going to treat your water, the cost of water treatment will be higher for you. But if you don't have the resources to do any water treatment, then your exposure or your risk to disease or contamination will be higher in that case. Now, of course, there's a lot we can do to combat this impact and to make sure that when all of these climate stressors are impacting Lagos over the next 30 years, we stand a better chance to maintain the quality of our lives. One of the things that we can do, of course, is, I can't talk about everything because I don't have time, but I'll just highlight 3 things that we could do. First, invest a lot more in public infrastructure. Not that the Lagos government is doing anything. I think there's quite a lot that's been done, but more needs to be done. For instance, the project, I don't know if there's anyone who recognizes the project that's pictured on this slide. Does anybody recognize? Well, I think if it gets completed, maybe it'll take the pressure off some of the public transport systems and improve Lagos's chance of being resilient. Now, we need to figure out how to commoditize renewable energy. It just has to happen. Because the population of Lagos, the quality of the economy in Lagos, the demand for energy requires that we need to start transitioning away from what we're doing at the moment. And so we've got to figure it out. Either it's going to be grid tie, it's going to be off-grid, or it's going to be standalone systems. Somehow we have to find a way to commoditize renewable energy. The other thing is we have to figure out how to build resilient homes or resilient structures. Structures that would survive the kinds of pressure and the kinds of impact that Lagos will be subjected to on a regular basis, especially in places that are most vulnerable, like rural areas, and like the slums. And this is an example of an innovative project that tried to do something like that. I haven't seen that many projects replicate this style. Who recognizes this? This is a floating school. Now, if we don't do anything, if we continue with business as usual, what will we see in Lagos in the next 30 years? Very likely, some people will still be enjoying. Do you agree? Well, this is Eco-Atlantic. And, they started construction, and this is what it's supposed to look like in the next 20 to 30 years. So let's assume that it's completed. People will be living large. But not everyone. The capacity of this place, unfortunately, is 250,000 people. Maybe an additional 150,000 people who will commute there every day to work. But that's it. Now, on the other extreme of the spectrum, remember what we said about population? There will be an explosion of urban poor. So you'd have the slums would explode with people. And what will we see there? Of course, there would be worsening of the environmental conditions. There will be higher competition for economic activities. There will be loss of productivity. Maybe a whole lot more volatility. Well, if you don't fit into any one of these two extremes, what's going to happen to you? Well, if your social media feeds are anything to go by, you'll be watching this from Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Amara, for this quite contrasted and sobering perspective. So any contacts and connection with Canada, please move to this guy. Thank you so much. I've taken some note, but I will be back on them and to ask you further questions. So if you all agree, let's move now to Iheanyi, who also has some maybe corrections to make with my pronunciation, with your first name. Sure, and some slides as well.
Thank you very much, Tancrède. The name is Iheanyi ONWUEGBUCHA. Now, I've been called so many things, so you're good. Where's the clicker? Oh, okay. Good. So, I've made a slight change in my presentation. We figured that 10 minutes is too small to speak about my two interests. So I'm going to be speaking about my recent exhibition, which is still on, called Diaspora at Home. But I'll start with a story. 2 years ago, I was having a conversation with the late founder of CCA, BC Silva. And in the midst of the conversation, she referred to me as an Igbo diaspora in Lagos. It was strange for me, and it got me thinking. And if we want to define what diaspora means, the dictionary definition says diaspora is used to refer to any migrant group and their descendants who maintain a link with their place of origin. Now, the reference to me being an Igbo diaspora in Lagos is very correct. But I found that it's quite rare to use the word diaspora to refer to Africans living on the continent of Africa. We know about the African diaspora, like the first speaker said, referring to Africans or black people across the world outside the African continent. But then the question is, why not use the word diaspora for people living in Africa? This is strange if you try to juxtapose the two persistent themes when we discuss Africa. One, Africa has had a long history of practice of migration within the continent. And second, we have a very, very close attachment to place, particularly land. Therefore, last year when I was preparing an exhibition with my colleague, Sophie Portelon, okay. Okay. At the Center for Contemporary Art called Diaspora at Home. This question of being in diaspora in one's own continent and at one's own country was the center of focus. Now, the exhibition provided an opportunity for us to engage with different conversations one could have about mobility and movement of people in Africa. And then, of course, you talked about the south-north migration through the Sahara and through the Mediterranean. But that's not all there is to movement of Africans. We also found that about 97% of Africans actually move within the continent of Africa, as against what we see in the media of Africans trying to migrate to Canada, like Amara said. Yes, Africa is a continent on the move. And we've had a long history of migrations, beginning with lots of myths of origins of so many African ethnic groups, like the Bantu expansion of movement from Central Africa, the Hamitic migration from north to south, and even the Voortrekkers Great Trek in South Africa. The current exhibition at CCA, Diaspora at Home, which I will say was organized thanks to two French institutions, the Alliance Française in Lagos and the Institut Français in Paris, in collaboration with Cadiz Foundation and Art Foundation in Paris as well. The exhibition provided, like I said before, an opportunity to reflect on the role of artistic forms in the circulation of knowledge within the African continent. Now we talk about movement, migration, mobility, but interestingly, it's not just people that move. Ideas also circulate around the continent. Languages, cultures, objects, food, and a whole lot more circulate around the continent. Now, we invited 8 artists of diverse backgrounds, all with connection to Africa, to look at this idea of movement on the continent. And the fascinating stories shared by these artists provided an important tool, an entry point to the construction of Africa and its people in the modern world. But I won't go deep to all the stories shared by the 8 artists. I chose 4, which I will use to illustrate what it means to move around Africa. I will start with Laura Hainaut. Laura Hainaut is French, but has spent 4 years researching the Comoros Islands, which I found very interesting. The Comoros Islands is some tiny collection of islands towards the south of Africa, southern Africa, in the Pacific Ocean. And one interesting thing about this is that one of the islands is still a French territory, the island of Mayotte. And I found it quite interesting that in the 21st century, there's still a French colony, call it what you may, in Africa. But that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is that within this group of islands that share a common culture, language, in fact, they have families in different islands. The island of Mayotte, of course, because it's a French territory, has a higher standard of living. So the tendency for people to move towards that island is very high. And then there are strict immigration rules. So it's difficult for people to move from the other islands to Mayotte, to visit family, to trade, to do whatever. Remember, these were all, prior to the entrance of France, these were all one fluid country, sharing the same culture, the same language, the same religion, and family ties. Now, what the artist did in this short 20-minute video was to follow the life of Ben. Ben is the young man there, who was being trained at that time to transport illegally migrants from the other islands into Mayotte at night without light and a boat. Now imagine what it feels like to be in an open sea without light as a child, not up to 18. The reason being that children will not be prosecuted if they are caught, so they are free in a way. So they use children to transport illegal migrants from all the other islands into Mayotte. So the artist followed the life of Ben, and they went on one of the trips where he was being trained to navigate the sea at night without light. And for me, this raises the question of how is it possible for you in Africa not to be able to visit your family in the same region because you don't have a piece of paper? Are you alive? Well, we go over to the next artist. Oh, okay. Nuit is from Tunisia, but he lives in Paris. And he's taking another interesting story, which is the story of over 200,000 African soldiers that fought in the First World War for France. Now, most of these people were conscripted into the army, fought a war they didn't know anything about. They didn't know the beginning, neither did they know the end. A lot of them died. And the most interesting, although sad, fact is that these over 200,000 men that fought in this war are nameless. I think a few years ago, the French president had a ceremony to commemorate these soldiers. But I quote, he said, he used the term, these nameless soldiers that fought for our country. So what the artist did, quickly, was to take the photographs of these soldiers, some of the photographs of these soldiers from the French magazine La Mirror, featuring Senegalese and Berber infantrymen, as they were referred to, make portraits of them. Of course, if you're interested in the arts, you know the value of portraiture and the political power of being painted or drawn provides to an individual. He makes portraits of these soldiers, cuts them into half, and then juxtaposes them with images of living and known people, thereby giving them the identity that they've been denied, but also provoking you to reflect on the fact that some people were taken out of their country to fight a war they didn't know and they don't know anything about, and remain nameless. Now, quickly, the next artist, Badi Dalul, who is also French, but with Syrian origin. Badi spent 3 weeks in Lagos last summer. And during his residency, he shared some very interesting facts. One, that sometime when the Americas were being discovered, and there was a huge influx of people from around the world, particularly the Middle East, to the New World in the Americas. Some people from the Middle East, particularly Lebanon and Syria, who wanted to get to the New World to discover the opportunities and were also fleeing the conflicts in their region, found themselves in West Africa. Some, because they couldn't afford to move any further. Others, interestingly, were deceived into coming to West Africa. They boarded a ship thinking they were going to Mexico and Brazil, but they found themselves in the coastal countries of West Africa, most especially Senegal. They were offloaded, and they found that they've been cheated and deceived, and they can't proceed anymore. So they settled in West Africa. And that is one of the reasons why you have a lot of Lebanese in Senegal. And also some of these people have moved to other West African countries. But also, not all of them migrated to West Africa this way. Some actually saw opportunities in West Africa and sent for the family members to come. But back to his work. So Badi spent 3 weeks in Nigeria, in Lagos particularly, studying and interacting with the Lebanese community here, and found 3 people of 3 different generations. One, interestingly, if you know Signature Gallery, Rahman Aka, who grew up in Sierra Leone, migrated to Lagos, started an antique business, and is quite successful. For the artists, this is one of so many success stories of people who have actually moved downwards from the Middle East as against the South-North movement that we all know. And one of so many examples of people. So he decided to do what we do here, to celebrate these individuals by making commemorative fabrics, printing their photographs, writing their stories, and sewing them into a dress in his size, putting his story, his life story into the life of these people. Now, the last artist, Chloe Kenum, who is also French, but with background and family in Benin Republic, takes us to another interesting story of migration and movement in Africa. One, the life of fruits. We go to a grocery store in Paris, in London, New York, even in Lagos here, we buy fruits. You buy a banana, you eat, and it's available to you all year round. But how many people here actually pause to wonder where the apple that is sold in traffic in Lagos come from? Or the banana you eat from the grocery stores in Paris, where they actually come from? Some of these fruits have traveled thousands of miles to the shelves where you eat them. And the artist over the years has been studying how fruits move from one country to the other. In this project, she took 2 interesting fruits. One, the date, which comes all the way from Libya, but is hawked all over Lagos. and then tangerines that are imported from South Africa, the two ends of the continent of Africa, and puts them together with the everyday fruit that are produced around Lagos, to draw our attention to the fact that, yes, we have these things, but they've actually moved. And as these fruits move, they gather history, they gather stories, they have a life of their own as they move around the continent. So what did she do? She covered them in the traditional way fruits are preserved in Benin Republic with clay, as they would be in the traditional way if they are to be transported to a long distance. Now, beyond the stories of these artists, the spread of culture in Africa, including trade, education, love, marriage, are mainly responsible for migrations in the continent since the 10th century, beginning with the trans-Saharan gold trade across Africa. It will therefore be erroneous to attribute mobility of Africans to the presence of Europeans in the continent and to slave trade. You may know, you may not know, that in West Africa, for instance, from Borno to Futatoro, political transformations were already taking shape long before the trade with Europeans and long before the first Europeans set foot on the shores of West Africa. In fact, West Africa had mining technologies, economic transformations, political reorganizations, and it was on these foundation that the Europeans began their colonial process. Therefore, with the rising population explosion in urban areas in Africa, like Amara has highlighted, internal conflicts are bound to happen. Of course, these are provoked by shortage of resources, particularly land, as we already seen in Nigeria with the herdsmen and farmer clashes. And also, as we've seen recently in South Africa with the xenophobic attacks. And of course, the desire for international travel, made popular by Instagram. Of course, we want to travel to new places and click, 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 and post on Instagram. Now, all these things draw or call for a deep reflection of why Africans should move freely. And I would say one of the key things that led to this project is the fact that it's easier for me to travel to Europe than to travel to East Africa, and that shouldn't be so. And of course, I've had personal terrible experiences traveling to South Africa that I wouldn't want to share, which I have never experienced moving to Europe and traveling through the Americas. But back to why we're here. What does being alive mean to me? One, being alive means being able to travel. Being alive means being able to travel freely in Africa. Being alive means being able to live comfortably at home, even in the diaspora. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, with some final points which reconnect with what Maboula started to talk about and all these personal stories. So the warm thanks for all this. We can, maybe I could invite you to join here. You will feel like you're a billionaire in the Davos Economic Forum, so enjoy it. And while you're all sitting, maybe I can ask the very few people who answered my question, do you believe that ideas matter and can change the world, and who replied no, just to explain why. So can you remind me who said no at the back of the room, if I'm not wrong? Yes. Would you mind explaining briefly? I'm interested. Yeah. Maybe we need to record. Maybe we need to record so it won't be used against you. It's just.
I actually meant ideas only cannot change the world. You need to put in the work. That's all.
I was sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this. Another comment on from the no side around yourself? No? No, it's okay. Thank you. So let's start the debate. Can you hear me well with this mic? Yes. So let's start the debate. If you have any questions regarding the very content of the presentation, some clarification, please raise your hand. If you have comment coming to your mind. I have a few questions I would like to return to you, but pending this, you're very welcome in asking for the mic and the first and quick reaction. It can be on the substance. It can just be something you remember, you simply remember, and you would like to raise. Does anyone want to take the mic? Yes. The mic is coming with a pink trouser.
Thank you. So, first of all, thank you to all the speakers. Very interesting. I have a question for Mr. Amara regarding your presentation. So, indeed, you show that population in Lagos is increasing by 3% every year. And this, I was a few weeks ago in Ethiopia, and I was seeing the fact that though there are 100 million people, Addis Ababa is only 3 million. So I was reflecting on why, indeed, urbanization in Nigeria, but as well in neighboring countries, is increasing at that speed. So maybe you could help me understand that point. And then the second question would be how to decrease this rate of 3% going around, or what is your idea about how to go about decreasing this tendency? Yeah.
Thank you. And Canada is not an answer.
I don't know if Canada is not an answer. Because a lot of young Nigerians believe that Canada is looking for people. There are some questions, some parts of your questions I can answer. And that's obviously because I don't know enough about that. But I know that the chief driver of population growth in Nigeria is not necessarily urban to rural to urban migration. It's more the birth rate. So Nigeria in general, we have an average fertility rate of, I think it's 5.35 live births per woman. And it varies, you know. So for instance, the farther up north you go, you know, then of course the higher the birth rates are. So for instance, in Lagos, you start at 3. By the time you get to Lokoja, you are at 6, and once you get to Kano, you are looking at 9. So that's really driving our population growth rate. Now, if that's what's driving, you know, what's the key driver, not necessarily the only driver, one of the things that we've learned from other countries around the world is empowering women. That's something that reduces birth rates and also helps reduce population growth rates. When women are empowered, not just in terms of, oh, give them sewing machines or, you know, the way we define empowerment in Nigeria, but when women have the power to decide what happens to their bodies, when women control their reproductive rights, when women decide a lot of things about what stages in their lives they make certain decisions, when they control the economy around them, women tend to have less children That's a fact. It's something that's been measured everywhere around the world. And it's something that if we did better in Nigeria, we will bring our population growth rate under control. Thank you.
Are you okay with the answer? Yeah. Another question, I don't see, yeah, at the back of the room, so the mic with the pink trouser will still continue to.
Hello, good evening, everyone.
Maybe you would like to know who is asking the question. Maybe you want to know what is your background, profession, or any information you feel interesting.
I just wanted to contribute to his answer regarding his question. The reason why Lagos has more population than the population in Addis Ababa. I know Addis Ababa is a commercial hub and same as Lagos. But I think that one of the reasons why we have more people in Lagos than in Addis Ababa is because Lagos, Addis Ababa is landlocked and Lagos is, has access to seaports. And because of that access, you have bustling trade and commerce. And hence, it drives more people to this part of Africa. Thank you.
Fair enough. Thank you. Another question, otherwise I will, if you don't mind, I can ask a few ones. Just writing down some notes on the basis of your presentation. So, Maboula, you mentioned information and knowledge, which have an impact on the demand for rights and for the demand for rights to be fulfilled. Can you tell us, in your everyday work and profession, it's a discussion we have bilaterally, but I would like to expose it to the people. What different jobs and occupation it leads you to have because you feel that writing and researching is not enough. When you have this diagnosis, when you have this knowledge, the question is what you do with this knowledge. So can you tell us if it drags you toward particular occupations you wouldn't have thought about when taking your job and position? Do you make more TV and media? Do you make more tweets and so on? I have plenty of stories of researchers which are quite desperate because they write huge pieces, 300 pages. They come to meet an MP, a member of parliament, and they say, look, I have a brilliant idea on the, I don't know, a trade agreement. And the MP answered is, well, fine, can you tweet your ID? And say, come on, it's a 300-page book. I cannot tweet the ID. Okay, do you have a blog? And it's over. So on the basis of diagnosis you've made, and what can you tell us a little bit more on how do you try to reach out to the target you intend to reach out?
Thank you very much for this question. This is a very important, serious, and not easy to answer question. I think the production, I think you're really hinting at the political structure of the world and how the world operates. I think knowledge production is one element, right? People do research. People sometimes may gain the luxury to spend their time to be paid to carry out research and do their findings. Once they get the results, whatever the discipline, what do you do next? And what is the purpose of those findings? So, knowledge has been produced historically by human beings from, I don't know, like so many millennia ago. What we are interested in now is how knowledge can be, let's say, ranked. What is of importance, what is not of importance, what is worthy of being known, what is not worthy of being known, what will be, what will constitute, I don't know, the program or the curriculum that you need to master to get a degree, right? Which means that you can have a form of knowledge that will never constitute, that will never be part of the curriculum that you will study in the schools, that will grant you a certification, that will also grant you a certain type of profession, right? So this is the first point. Knowledge is being produced by human beings everywhere. Any type of, I mean, knowledge exists in all types, but knowledge is not valued the same way. The second thing that we can add on this is that if we rely on the example that you've just provided, there is an issue. There is climatic change and what will happen to Lagos and other cities of the world in 2050, in 2075. Somebody has the answer. Somebody has the answer. And go find the people in charge, the politicians, or the people who are responsible for public policies. Public policy that, in theory, are supposed to bring good to the greatest numbers. The public policies that are supposed to take care of the general population. That's in theory, right? We started from the premise that the world is, hierarchy exists, political hierarchies exist, and we human beings and societies navigate those hierarchies that are produced and that are in operation. So the question of producing knowledge and reaching the people who have the power to enforce the solutions that have been produced is paradoxically also a problem of language. It is as if scholars spoke one language, politicians speak another, and the general population speak another. So all we need to do is translate. Right? All we need to do is translate. So it might be very difficult to translate 200 pages of any findings into 120 characters for Twitter, right? It is very complicated. But I think that there should be a way and there should be a responsibility for this researcher, for this scholar, to make sure that the knowledge that she or he has produced circulate. But that also takes us back to the political dimension of knowledge production. Do you want to have your knowledge circulate? Are you trying to get paid for the circulation of your knowledge? Do you want to be close to the politicians? Do you want to be seen on television and acknowledged as the first person who has said this or that or this or that? When we know that we have produced knowledge for a long time. We are improving things, but are we really inventing things? I don't know, as human beings. So that would be the last point. To go back to the question you asked me, I think that, yes, one of the responsibilities that I have felt is precisely to go and try to share the knowledge I've had access to with general audiences and to translate academic jargon into a level of speech that is that can be understood by the greatest numbers. To me, that's resistance. That's an affirmation of life. This is the responsibility, because there is elitism exists, and there is something to be gained to let's say bathe in your ivory tower. Right? You're the big PhD, you're the professor, you're invited by the French embassy to come to Lagos, Nigeria for 1 week. Why not? Right? But is it the only thing that you can do with that? And I think that the way academic jargon is produced really makes the, this world of ideas an elitist world. And the more academic you sound, the better and the smarter, the more intelligent you're supposed to be. And the question is not about what is the effect of, or what can be drawn from your productions. So what are we doing? What are we producing for? What are we researching for? What do we want? That's a question. My answer to this question is to share. Okay. Thank you.
A round of applause for your answer. You share this vision, or you have some nuances to bring to this answer on your own sense of, do you need to perform other jobs or to translate or to be different in what you're doing just to reach out a wider audience or target, or do you think you're doing the right thing? Both of you.
Well, I think I agree with her, and on the art, what we try to do is to break it down further to also break the barriers of language and all disabilities. Because some of the presentations, be it performance in whatever form of art, music, and the visual arts, is meant to cut across all language groups. You're meant to experience them. So whatever message that is being presented in an exhibition, in a performance, usually is research that has been summarized, distilled into visual forms that anyone can understand, sometimes even sonic, if you cannot see. So I think, yes, breaking it down and presenting it beyond the professional language to a universal language is very important.
Oh, well, I think that when it comes to policy, advocacy, you have to stretch a lot beyond just creating the knowledge to engaging people, and beyond that, to get people to take action and to get people to take specific action. And that requires that you are able to do more than just create knowledge. For instance, part of our work around climate advocacy in Nigeria, we've had to produce a documentary, 2 documentaries, to put the story of climate, what we've learned from our research, into something that people can see. Because sometimes the words in a piece of paper or in a book or reading it on a blog might not just convey everything that needs to be seen or everything that needs to be understood. Sometimes you have to be able to understand what it would take to get your audience to the point where you want them to be when you are trying to communicate new ideas to them, and that's what I have learned. You also have to be aware that you're not just only you're not competing just only for mind share, you're competing for attention as well. And that's because there's a lot of content that's being created in the world at the moment. And there are ways, different ways in which that content is delivered to people. And so you're not guaranteed people's attention. You know, people are going to be on their phones looking at different things, even while they're watching your documentary. Even when you put out a report online, people are going to be distracted by the latest trending topic on Twitter, the latest conversation that's going on. So you've got to be aware that attention spans are short. You don't have that undivided attention. So you have to have a strategy for getting people's attention before you even start thinking of, acquired mind share. So yes, I agree with you. There's breaking it down to language that they would understand. But there's also now that problem, that challenge of gaining attention. And you find that a lot of people are becoming very desperate with it. So you find that people are becoming more controversial than they should be. They're becoming more provocative because they want to spark a conversation or they want to be noticed, per se. And that's, what's happening.
Yes, I do agree. Any further question from the audience? Many hands up, so...
Hi, my name is Shehu Daniel. I'm a computer engineer, so I support what he was saying about reaching the last mile. You're probably talking about reaching the last mile. As for research work, there's a lot of things that go into research, so it's going to be a big document. It'll always be big. Now, not everyone has to reach research. The last mile is the product. So I'll use maybe an iPhone, for instance. For the buyer, all you see is just a little manual. I'm sure there are no manuals even in the phones these days. But at the back end, those who are producing it, the development team, the manufacturers, there's so much documentation that the last person cannot see. So if we put it down to policies also, our constitutions are very large. Not everyone can read it, but they'll be summarized. So, yeah, as we're trying to advocate and do things around certain topics, we should also know that research work is for the thinkers. The thinkers will think, they'll produce those documents. We have other people like ourselves, the advocates, who will now work towards shrinking those documents to be able to pass on that information to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Let's take a round of comments and questions, and then we have further reaction from the panel. So, who are the next? Congratulations,
All right.
You managed to get the mic.
Thanks. So let me just use the opportunity to ask all the questions because the mic may not come back to me again. All right, for Amara, you talk about the refinery, for instance, pollution, and I used Niger data as case study. Thank God that to an extent they'll be able to solve some of the oil spillage, airborne diseases due to air pollutions and all that. And this is coming to a population where you have many people around. The idea I'm saying is that how can we separate industrial location from residential location? Because the place, I guess, I've not seen the place exactly, but I know it's around Lekki area. That means there's a residential area around that place already. So industrial is coming to meet residential, which happened to Apapa Tinkan Light, where residential has been, but industrial came to meet. Now there's conflict. Can't our government or policymakers learn from what has happened? Is it that you relocate those people from that area and put a policy that residential must not go beyond this point, so that we won't have all these things? I think that will change a lot. So I want to ask that, how do we balance gain over life? Then for Iheanyi, I want to ask that for visa restriction and all that, even Africa is still far. Even within Nigeria is far. Even within states, I think states is far. Even within Lagos, some cannot cross from mainland to island. Even within island, some cannot cross that two gates. So the point is, why we put in this restriction? Could it be that security is threatened? So are we choosing security over bonds, as in love, or connecting, than over security? Because I used to say that toll gate, I don't think that it's being put up for security as priority or for money for people to pass. Because I think when your speed limit is much or something, it should be detecting a lot of security things rather than just collecting toll fee and people go. So when we are setting up some of these things, we should think about life first than just the business aspect of it. And the third one for her, you mentioned about children. You said, can you be alive when you are poor? And one of the SDG goals is zero hunger. And I want to connect it to that. Can the SDG goal for zero hunger be achieved on time so that we won't lose a lot of people? That means food needs to be provided as much as possible to the poor so that we can save a lot of life. I like the SDG goal because they are not like the Vision 2020 that was cancelled at a point, because they felt putting long time may not really make a lot of impact. So I think they are putting into 10 years maximum now to see what can be achieved in time. So I don't know what you can mention to that, how this SDG goal can be intensified so that a lot of people can be alive before they go.
Thank you for this comment, and you can hear me. Thank you for this comment and question. I would have many on SDGs, in particular, do they help achieve the goal they set or not? The very existence of the SDG, did it help or not? It's another question. Let's take 3 more questions, and then we have a first round of answer.
Hello, sorry for my English. I'm a Senegalese, so I speak Wolof and French, but I will try to do my best. Regarding the question of knowledge, I totally agree with Dr. Maboula. I think when we talk about knowledge, what kind of knowledge are we talking about? Is it an academic one? And if it's an academic one, is it a Western one or a non-Western, from the Western world? Can you hear me? Not. I tried to do my best to raise my voice. Yes. Can you hear me now?
Raise your voice.
Yes, better raise your voice. Yes. So when we are talking about knowledge, what kind of knowledge are we talking about? Is it an academic knowledge? And if so, is it the Western knowledge or the non-Western knowledge? And if it's not an academic one, can we say also emotion, arts, is also another way to get knowledge, as Bergson is talking about also memories, how memories and cleverness is done by emotion. So what kind of knowledge are we talking? So it's my first question. And also this idea of that knowledge, academic knowledge, is an elitist thing. It reminds me Orwell. It's a noveling. I have studied economics at the Sorbonne. So before becoming a filmmaker, and in economics, it's a language for those who are initiated. And in this way, even in Senegal, those who had access into knowledge before the colonialism, it was those who were initiated. So it's another question that I'm raising there, because I think it's a false idea to think that today we all can have access to knowledge. It has been democratized, or whatever. You can understand what I'm trying to say. And the third point where I want to go, it's, of course, as a filmmaker, I didn't work in economy because I knew that the new, I would say, language, it's image. But I'm not agree about the NGO film or so-called documentary, because, again, it's a knowledge and it's a kind of image that has a purpose, and a specific purpose for a specific audience. And film, documentary film, should move people from another way of, where it's not only academic and rational knowledge, it's also about the image, emotion, and the other senses. Thank you.
I will take one last question, then we move back to the room. So I'll let you choose. Then we'll back to you. I promise.
My name is Sunday, and I write for Guardian newspapers. My question is for the last speaker.
Try to speak loud as much as possible, because we...
Okay. Most African leaders have signed the African Free Trade Agreement. So what do you think can be done so that challenges of free movement will not be a threat to the Free Trade Agreement? That's for the last speaker. Thank you.
So if you're okay, let's stop there. We'll take 5-10 minutes to answer, and then we'll move back to you. Okay? So we have, starting in the reverse mode, we have a question on free trade agreement and the free mobility of people. What kind of perspective does it create here in Nigeria, according to you, if you have any answer on this point? We have questions moving backward on the Western knowledge versus non-Western knowledge, and the fact that language is or remains for initiated people. And there's a false democracy there. Maybe it's more for you. Maboula. We have the zero anger achieved on time, meaning within the next 10 years. What's your take on that? We had another question on the movement and restriction for money, restriction for security, not only in the Indian Ocean, but in the very place where we're talking here. Another point, it's still on research in the vacuum, which for me it's who is the end user of your research, or what is your own favorite target. And last, on residential location versus industrial location, what can be done to balance this, to avoid overlapping? This is what I noted. That's why I wanted to stop, because I'm very slow in writing down, and then we'll be back to you. So in any order, just pick up the few hints I mentioned and try to answer.
Okay. I have two comments and questions to me, so I will take both of them together. Now, we need to understand that, one, movement can never be stopped. We will keep, it is part of what we are as human beings. We've always moved from being hunter-gatherers. We've always moved from one place to the other in search of better resources. But then, the question of the first comment on restrictions of movement for security, to show off class, and what have you, in whatever form, in small areas in large countries, visa restrictions, toll gates. I will take it back to Amara's presentation about planning and policy formulation. If, for instance, in Lagos, the policymakers and the city planners do the right thing and plan Lagos properly, I wouldn't have the need to want to live in Lekki, for instance. I could live in Yaba and do my business without having to want to cross the bridge. Also, those in Banana Island, if things are planned properly, and yes, even distribution of resources, those in Banana Island will not feel threatened by the influx of people who are beneath the class of people who live in Banana Island into the island. And we won't have the need for all the security checks at the gate and all those restrictions in movement. And believe me, 60, 50, 40 years ago, it wasn't this difficult to move to Europe or to move to the Americas from Africa. It was way, way easier. But without proper planning and proper policy formulation, the income and social divide will increase, and the natural tendency is for you to protect yourself, which is what we see in South Africa. As the resources diminish, you want to protect what is yours. And if we go back again to when we had, pre-colonial Africa, when people moved almost freely, it was usually to trade. I have spices, I want to trade for something else. It wasn't necessarily to move because of economic reasons. And when people are fleeing for perhaps conflict or economic reasons, there is always resistance because we've had wars. So it's not completely new. So the answer I will give is proper policy development to even the distribution of resources. Now, on the question of the free trade agreement that is being discussed in Africa, the same thing will happen. It's not enough to sign agreements. If Nigeria does not get their shit together, pardon my French, countries like Ghana and South Africa, as we're seeing, will feel threatened because we have a lot of, we have a very high population. And the tendency, it's natural, we'll migrate towards where the grass is greener. And if, back to policy planning and even distribution of resources, if we don't plan properly, will renege on these agreements, and there will still be restrictions in trade. We're already seeing it in what's happening with China and Africa relations, where the influx of goods from China is threatening local industry. So it's not enough to sign trade agreements. We have to put our spaces in order to protect ourselves and also to protect the other countries.
Thank you. Let's move next.
I think the only thing that was directed at me was from, I mean, I welcome the comment from our Senegalese friend. I agree with 50% of what you say. I think that, you know, documentaries are not just, in fact, film shouldn't be just an aesthetic experiences, intellectual experiences. I think they could be aesthetic experiences too as well, that not just engage your intellect, but engage your emotions as well. And I think we go for that too when we try to communicate, because you're trying, you know, especially when it comes to climate change, it's such a technical issue that the first experience you want people to have of it is to have an emotional connection to the topic, not an intellectual one. It's the emotional connection that makes people curious and makes them want to learn more, which is to engage the harder and the more difficult to grasp aspect of it. I'm just going to offer a proverb in response to my friend here who talked about the separation of industrial and residential areas, because when it comes to water, what we've learned with water bodies, there's a lot of interconnectivity that you can't just say, oh, because industrial area is different from residential area. Well, the proverb is this, you know, be careful while peeing in the stream, because you might not know your brother might be downstream fetching drinking water for the household. The point is that something might happen in Lekki doesn't mean that, to a water body in Lekki doesn't mean that it wouldn't affect people in Ikeja. It can't, because water bodies are interconnected. So what we have to do is to be far more careful about how we handle waste. Also, we have to be conscious about how we treat the environment. Because I think there's this perspective we have of the environment. I think I had it growing up, that it's always going to be there. Nothing is going to change. The trees that we see every day, they're always going to be there. The rivers are always going to be clean. The land is always going to be available. We've never really grew up with the perception that these are finite resources that can actually finish. And I think that's something that we need to change. We need to change our approach about how we look at the environment. And we need to see the environment as a resource that we need to preserve, we need to conserve, and we need to protect. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for the applause. So I give the floor back to you. Before this, one point you mentioned was the top 1%. You say, okay, well, in the disaster business as usual scenario, there will be 1%, the top 1%, the well-off will be perfectly fine. Yeah. And you mentioned as well, with a more even distribution of income, it would be easier just to make migration and mobility entitled. It reminds me with a survey, opinion survey in the US. The question was, do you think you belong to the top 1%? 1,000 people over the phone. So on average, the answer would have been that 1% of respondents would have responded, yes, I belong to the top 1%. 17% replied, yes, I belong to the top 1%. Because they dreamed they could be part of the top 1%, this is one version, or they fear so much to be at the bottom end that they magnify and exaggerate their position. What do you think the answer would be in Lagos? Do you belong to the top 1%? What is the traction of this top 1%? I think it's very high, and as long as it's very high, because you want to be there, as I can say, I am quite optimistic on the flow of people to Canada. Yeah. I can pessimistic on the future of any country, and I don't talk only about Nigeria, but as long as people want to be on the top 1%, because they feel it's the only place on earth where they can have all their rights entitled and so on.
If I may,
Yeah.
and I think that's going to tie up to some of the things that have been said and that have been asked. I think that what we're talking about here is a very important point that Iheanyi made. We're talking about the distribution of wealth. When we're talking about proper policies, the good thing, the right thing to do, we are talking about the distribution of wealth. And the example that you've just given with the people imagining themselves at the top, you know, the 1%. People need, of course, I'm not surprised by the result of this US poll, and I wouldn't be surprised by the results to be obtained in any part of the world, because people need this illusion, because people need to deal with that reality. But that reality rests on injustice. What we're talking about is social, economic, environmental justice. So whether one talks about you know, different social classes or different economic levels, access to clean water, whatever, borders, being able to cross or not cross borders. We're talking about these hierarchies. Borders serve a purpose. Inequalities serve a purpose. Is hunger going to be, the problem of hunger, is it going to be solved worldwide? I don't know. But is it an objective? That's an important question. Is one, I don't know, in the world or in, you know, policies, local, national, international, is it an objective to solve the hunger problem? It may be yes, it may be no. It seems like no, because we haven't solved it. Can we solve it? Yes, we can. Does it serve a purpose to keep people starving? Yes, it does. Do borders serve a purpose? Yes. Borders serve a purpose because you control populations. Does, I don't know, even when you were talking about security and we have borders because of security, or do we have borders because we really need them? You need to protect people who have a lot, otherwise they would be, or they might be attacked, or they might be simply bothered by the people who do not have. But the people who have need to have. And that's the purpose of their life. And they need to feel superior. Otherwise, there's no point in being rich or poor. Those two characteristics do not make sense. You cannot be rich if poor people don't exist. And you cannot be poor if rich people don't exist. So it's, you know, if we go back to one of the initial questions, like do ideas can change the world, or do, yes, ideas and representations and what we have in our imagination. How do we imagine ourselves as, you know, living beings? Do I need, as a human being, to feel superior? Yes or no? If I do, we are going to have, and we are having, the world that we have today. If we can imagine ourselves in another type of interaction with other individuals and other communities and other nations, maybe we won't even need nations. I don't know. The world as it exists today, and that takes us back to what you were saying, is just the world as it exists today. There were other forms of existence before, and I hope there will be other forms of existence after this world. But right now we think that this is the world as it has always been. And sometimes it's scary to think that things are finite. But I think things are finite, just life is finite. And we're talking about life right now, and the first principle is that as human beings, we are going to die. This is what we need to accept as human beings. If we don't deal with that, then we'll live in fear all our life, and we're still going to die. So we need to accept the game. We are alive right now, and we are surely going to die, sooner or later. And that sooner or later, depending on, you know, access to clean water, access to, you know, those resources and stuff. But this is what we're talking about, this management of resources. So I'll stop there, but I wanted to go back to the question of the knowledge I was talking about. In the question that was asked, I was specifically talking about academic knowledge, that I don't see as the only form of knowledge. I was just talking about the realm, the world that I navigate, and this is a form of knowledge that is highly valued in our societies, in specific societies. What I mean highly valued, I'm talking about economic terms, what you can live on. You can be a very wise person that might not get you a job, right? So I'm not talking about what is worth. When I think about knowledge, everything is, everything is the same in my mind, in abstraction. Everything is the same. In societies, how they operate, they're not valued the same. That's all I meant. So you can be emotionally intelligent, right? You can be a caring person, a loving person. You can be, full of empathy. You might not have access to water, right? You might be very mean, and you might be selfish, and you might be emotionally unintelligent, and you can still be a PhD and be in Lagos, Nigeria. So it all depends. And then Western or non-Western or whatever. What is commodified? That's the word I was looking for. In these market economies, where things are sold and bought and exchanged and given valued or devalued, let's look at what matters, and let's look at how we can make fully democratic the things that might help the largest numbers, if that is our objective. But it might not be. As I said, those hierarchies, whatever they are, they serve a purpose. Somebody, some group, some nation, some region, some continent benefits from them. This is why they exist. People are not just nice or nasty. They have a benefit in doing what they're doing. They're doing it for a reason. And let's be very clear on those reasons. So even if 1% can benefit, that will be those 1%, and they will be extremely happy.
Yeah. Thank you for this. When talking about PhD who are stupid emotionally, I was afraid you would look at me, but I'm relieved. I'm relieved.
I was looking at myself. Don't worry.
We have a problem of kind of. We officially have 10 minutes left, which is short. So I can make a commercial offer with 5 or 10 minutes. Still, we need to be selective, not in the people who will talk, but in the very questions we want to ask. So try to make them brief and targeted to one particular speaker, if you can. So how many people would like to, we have Yo on the list, 2, 3, 4, I can count, 5, 6. I've learned at school, yes. So can we stop at 6? Okay. It means roughly 2 each. So you're doing the bad job, which is to start choosing. Okay.
Hello, good evening. Kalechi is my name. So I'm going to go against the rules a bit. It's actually a comment based on the last thing that was said. It was what was going on in my mind. So when this talk first started, I was thinking about alive, and when you were speaking about your reasons for being alive, I thought about Frankenstein's monster, and I started thinking about Sesame Street. In Sesame Street, there's this song says, is it alive because it eats, feeds, grows, and that's how you know. And so the thing that came to mind is autonomy. And so very neatly, it led to the next talk, which was about, well, the talk after actually, which was about movement and what is more autonomous than movement, right? The idea that you can choose how and where and what you want to do and where you want to go. But then I kept on sort of hitting this roadblock, and this roadblock was about, we hear policy all the time. It seems like we're trying to work ourselves within a system that, which is what I think you're getting to, that is designed to not produce the effects that we want on a very fundamental level. And so sort of really smart people like you on stage have a dilemma, which is that you have to work within a system and you have to sort of create magic or create, sort of engage people within a system that is designed, to prevent what you're doing from happening. A system that functions based on all of those deficiencies that you've highlighted on the stage. But it brought me back to my own worldview. I started thinking, so in the end, just to be quick, I can see his pen clicking, my worldview, and on how important it is to have a worldview. So as a filmmaker or sort of a person who's a wrangler of the arts, as I like to call my friend, or a maker like myself, we have different views of what we want our world to be. And the thing that a person like people like you who are of letters have, the advantage you have is that you can translate your worldview into an idea that can become policy, and policy that can manifest in a real way. So it brings me to my question for you guys. What is your view of this new world system, or a change of world systems that that drives all of these your ideas and drives your sort of your mission, because you're all on missions if you're asking these questions for life?
Thank you. My name is Edmodasu. I want to ask the last speaker, being alive is to feel at home even in the diaspora. What do you actually mean in the word feel at home? Is it in time of culture, freedom of expression and profession? Is it in time of right, like Amara said? What do you mean by feel at home when even in the diaspora, even as African, I'm a Togolese. But how do I feel at home in Nigeria when there's even discriminations? Thank you.
That's clear. Thank you very much. Let's move downward, sorry. Yes.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Olabisi. I'm a GIS analyst and I'm a natural resource analyst. My question goes to Amara, the guy of public policy. I want to ask you, why is it possible for the government to send its instrument, that's an institution, to do an environmental impact assessment at Ibejuleki, where you have Dangote refinery, and still went ahead with giving 16,000 acres, according to one of their research, to Dangote for a refinery. And my question now is, why do they throw out the cost-benefit analysis for whatever they are going to get from Dangote? And where is the place of the impact of the environment on the people in terms of the atmosphere, water bodies, the natural assets in terms of streams, the fishes, and millions of microplanktons and phytoplanktons they are burying down there, because I went there. It's my study area for my thesis. And so my question goes to, you were talking about policy, and she was talking about the language to interpret research to policymakers. Even if they understand the language of the outcome of your findings, why do they still go ahead to do things that is glaring, is very glaring? Nobody does that. Nobody puts such a thing in places like Lagos, and they still went ahead to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, I got that.
Thank you. Moving still around.
Okay.
Just one after the other. Let's start with you, madam. Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Maya, and my question is for Mr. NWANKPA. One of my favorite quotes is by French author Gustave Flaubert, and he said, when he was asked why he had no children, he said, and I like to think with horror, I will transmit to no one the aggravations and disgrace of existence. Basically saying to be alive is just full of aggravations and disgrace, which Maboula talked about. You have class divides. These are aggravations we have to navigate. You have, gender issues, all sorts of things you have to navigate whilst you're alive. And I think the one thing you mentioned was your ability to, I think your ableness to learn or to absorb Western culture or Western education. If you're intellectually able, you might be able to cross some divides, get a proper education, get a living, or whatever. And Iheanyi also mentioned some of the divides in immigration. So you have to navigate those as well. It's quite frankly a disgrace that an African in Africa can move from one island to the other without having a child, manage a boat. But I think the bigger disgrace is probably being human on planet Earth and being restricted to wherever you're born. My daughter was born in the US, so she has access to about 200 countries. I am Nigerian and Ghanaian, and combined, I probably don't have access to up to 15 countries. So again, I'm stuck. But she isn't. She came from me. But again, these are political, border, immigration issues we all have to navigate, and these are serious aggravations. So my question really is, for the poor Lagosian in 2050, pardon me, who can't afford to go to Canada, probably doesn't have the intellectual capability to make it to Canada, or the, education, wealth, whatever, and he can't afford to live in Eco-Atlantic. So you have a very poor woman in 2050 Lagos. What does she do? Is there hope? Because the American child in 2050 America probably doesn't have to think of these issues, which the African poor woman or man, depending on your location, has to worry about. So would we get to a point where we would, as poor women say, we will transmit to no one the aggravations and disgrace of existence, of being alive in poor 2050 Lagos, or maybe any other African city, and then begin to really manage population and really look at, the quality of living of the African? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. One last, if I'm not wrong, or two last, at least one. Yeah.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. So my question is to Amara. So you talked about climate change as one of the things that can be catastrophic to the lower end of the food chain, the lower class people, in being alive in the future in, say, 2050 or 2075. I want to bring an angle to that conversation which I feel might be more imminent than climate change, which is automation, AI. And the fact that there is first off, there is a classism divide and there's an educational divide / economic divide, means that the people on the lower end of society wouldn't have access to the knowledge for them to adapt in this new world. And I also see that even reducing what we call the 1%, because we live in a transactional market. It's a trade market. You give knowledge or you give skill and you earn money. When these things, when some of our professions of today are replaced, how do you see Lagos, for instance, adapting to this new world that seems very imminent? Thank you.
Thank you. No last questions from anyone. I wouldn't like to frustrate anyone. No, it's fine. So let's move to this part of the stage. So we have roughly 5 questions. I'm sure you have noticed. You have them all in mind. So, who would like to start? Any of you?
Okay, I think I'll start. First of all, I'll address the issue of the challenge with government policy, EIAs, and why we will still go ahead with a project that doesn't enjoy the level of consensus that it should. I think there's, this is taking me a little bit away from what I was supposed to talk about today, but it's something that I know very well. It's called power asymmetry. And I think that in Nigeria, just like any other African country, power asymmetries are very extreme. I think it's something that we have in common with a lot of African countries. You've got extreme power differences between men and women, old and young, rich and poor, politicians and non-politicians. And the ability to cause action to be taken is extremely unbalanced. And I think it was Plato that said that the ultimate good is to be able to do anything you want to do without the fear, recourse of punishment. And the ultimate evil is to suffer every kind of punishment without recourse for vengeance. And so if you have the power to get away with anything, you will. Because it's the ultimate good. Justice itself is not a natural order. It's a social construct. It's a compromise. And for people who have power, it is an inconvenience. And therefore, when it comes to a situation where there is apparent, real power asymmetry, the powerful will always win. You have to find a way to solve the power asymmetry situation. So if they are not consulting you, if they don't care what you think, and they go ahead with a project that will poison your land, it's because you don't have, or you haven't demonstrated the power to take action or to do anything. And therefore that would happen. So when you see 1% enjoying 80% of the economy, it's because 99% people haven't proven that they have power to take any action to come to a compromise about how things are supposed to actually be done. And so that's the challenge, is how do we evolve policies that work for most people if most people are disconnected from what policies are about and they don't care and they don't want to take action about policy. And so what happens is you have majority of people want to join the 1%. Like you said, there is an aspiration. So the generality of action and generality of aspiration is, I just want to do what I need to do in order to be part of the 1%. You are not trying to make things more even. You are not trying to make things more fair. You just want to get your own ticket, win your own lottery, to be part of that 1% and oppress everyone else. And so that doesn't solve anything and still leaves us, frankly, where we are and where we're complaining about. Now, I wish I would be able to say what we could do to make things better. For instance, to make Nigeria more attractive, more open, or to make Lagos more habitable in the next 30 years. There are suggestions, but it would take a lot of collective action. It's not something that any individual can prescribe. It's not something that any government can decide this is what they're going to do unilaterally. It's going to take Lagosians to arrive at the consensus and say, this is the kind of city I want to live in. This is the kind of social justice I want to see. This is the kind of equality that I want to see. These are the kind of rules that we want to see. And they now have to take action to make it happen. And until that happens, the people who hold the reins of power will continue to make decisions that favor them. Thank you.
Okay. My friend from Togo asked a very direct question. I'm going to try as much as possible to provide a direct answer. What do I mean when I say being alive is being at home in the diaspora? I will illustrate with the chicken. Growing up, I grew up in Nsukka, and we had local chicken. When you buy chicken, in fact, we even have a saying in Igbo. The chicken, the new chicken in the compound, in the new neighborhood, tends to stand with one leg. And after some time, it will be able to stand with two legs. That is being at home in a new place. Now, your question of a Togolese being allowed to live freely in Nigeria without any form of discrimination is very interesting. And I put back this question to you. If it's not possible for someone, if you think it's not possible for someone to live in diaspora and be comfortable like the chicken that has put
the second foot down. Does it mean that you think it's utopian to be at home in diaspora? If your answer is yes, then does it mean that being alive is utopian? If you believe that for you to be alive, if you agree with me, that you need to feel at home, even in a new place, or even in a strange land, even in diaspora. That is the response I have. But then, I have a further comment. We've talked about the 1%. Everyone agrees that the 1%, and I'll borrow your words, will live large in 2050. But I also want to point out that living large is not an absolute. What we see in the world today, terrorism, the Arab Spring, visa restrictions, movement restrictions, is because of the widening margin, the divide. And if in 2050, like you project, the 1% lives large, and the others, because you did not provide an in-between in Lagos, the in-between would have moved to Canada. If, no, I know. If, yeah, yes. So if the other is living in the condition you projected, what it means is that the 1% will live in fear. Because kidnapping will increase, terrorism will increase, crime will increase, and even in the gated community of Eco-Atlantic, you will not be able to have a good night's sleep. And that, for me, is not living large.
Thank you.
Sorry. I think I'm going to answer the first questions about our visions of this world, but I'll begin by answering, adding to what was asked about this question of diaspora and being at home in diaspora. I think the diaspora, we don't have the time to have this full conversation here, but the diaspora can be the home, and the diaspora can be the home that has been made after the full acceptance of losing the original home. And homes can be remade. Homes can be relocated, they can be rebuilt. And that's what the history, particularly the history of the African diaspora, specifically that of the Atlantic, has taught. Homes have been made again. But to transition to the original question about our worldview, and perhaps to go back to what Flaubert said, I'm not going to have children because I'm not going to pass down this I don't know, terror, tragedy, horror that life is supposed to be. I have to say that I have lost a lot of illusions with the time passing. I used to be very passionate, very you know, forceful, and we can do this and we can do that. And the older I get, and the more, the weaker I get, and the more disillusioned I get. But I constantly, what remains, I will say, is the many proofs of the unpredictability and the beauty of human actions, despite the horrors, despite the crazy policies, despite the inequalities, despite the danger, despite the terrorism. Human beings, once they remember that they are human beings, free of all the dividing lines that we've spoken about, they do wonders, and this is what we have done throughout history. So yes, the larger the gap between social classes, the bigger the issues of security for the 1%, that's for sure. Is it what they want? I don't know. But they'll cling to that to a certain point. But that takes us back to history. And the history that I'm familiar with is the history of the French Revolution of 1789. At some point, the king will be killed. That's just a fact. that brings me back to the revolution, the Haitian Revolution of 1804. In Saint-Domingue, this French, the wealthiest French colony at the time in the Americas, the wealthiest French colony because it was the cruelest colony, the colony where slaves and, you know, enslaved Africans had the shortest life expectancy. The colony where enslaved Africans had to be imported constantly because nobody cared if they died because they would be replaced, right? That colony, that level of violence produced at the same time the extreme wealth of Saint-Domingue, therefore the wealth of France, but it also produced the only successful slave revolt of the Americas that produced a nation. That's the risk that France took by being so violent with those enslaved Africans. And now Haiti, as an independent nation, exists and has existed the way it has existed, but it has, like, this moment is foundational, I believe. So no matter the situation and no matter the extremism of those unbelievable situations, human beings are just unbelievable and unpredictable, even when managed by policies, even when managed by tyranny, even when managed by, I don't know what, everything that goes wrong. Who knows? We are all going to die, but we can do beautiful things until we do, and before we die. And this is what we have done. This is what the history of the world has shown. So let's just see it. So this is what I cling to, the possibilities in spite of what is determined, what is efficient, what works most of the time until it no longer does. So that's my
you.
view.
Nice words to conclude. We have to stop there. Human beings are unpredictable, and even Flaubert was unpredictable because at the very end of his life, he talked to his niece, you said niece? She just had a baby born, and he bent over the cradle and say, this is what I should have done. Yeah. So we made a long journey, and we reached a point, we have one last word, but we reached a point where we were about to talk about how to solve the power asymmetry and set up collective action with some internal side. It's a pity we have to stop here. But what I suggest is just to continue and to just kickstart this collective action in a very decentralized manner right after this meeting. So try to liaise as much as possible. There is plenty of intelligence in this room we did not exhaust. So try to be ambitious and exhaust until you leave this place and reach out to as many people as you can. So that's my thanks to all of you. It was a pleasure for me, and I hand over you for just the final words.
That will be very quick. Tancrède, you are in Abuja. You cannot know what we live. Being an expatriate here in Lagos, you know, last week I went back from my very silent village from south of France, and in the plane I tried to watch a film. And there was two Lagosians in front of me, speaking very, very loudly, and after an hour I said, please guys, can I please watch my film a little? And they say, hey, if you want silence, you can go to the cemetery. That's exactly the humor of Lagos. That's exactly why we love to be here. And Tancrède, you remember with Ugoma and with you last year, we were in this part of Alliance which was built. This was not existing. This was not alive. Only in Lagos you could have this center built and alive in 1 year. And this is something I love about this very difficult city, really. But because, as you said, we are not living only with ideas. You're absolutely right, but also with bread and wine. We are very, very happy to invite you now to have a cocktail. Not before, I would say that it was really great to work with you. It was really great to assist the Institut Français who organized all this evening from Abuja, my colleague Christelle and Cécile, and to have such prestigious panel. So it was great to have you. Thank you also for Tech Cabal. I have heard that my colleagues in Abuja say that this worked very, very nicely, so they could have the conversation live, and it was also a great honor, of course, to have our ambassador here. Voilà, this is your house, as usual, house of Ideas, and please now, cocktail.